Picture yourself waking up around 150,000 years ago. By every biological definition, you were already human. If someone from today somehow caught a glimpse of you from a distance, they might hesitate for a second, but they would still be looking at one of their own ancestors. You step out into the open African savanna, breathe in the cool morning air, and begin another ordinary day. One thought never crosses your mind. You don't wonder where your clothes are, because clothing simply isn't part of your world yet. Fast forward to this morning. Someone is standing in front of a closet, staring at two nearly identical shirts, trying to decide which one feels more appropriate. We spend money on clothes, judge first impressions by them, and even create laws defining how much of the human body can be uncovered in public. Wearing clothes has become so deeply woven into everyday life that it feels less like a choice and more like part of being human itself. But why? When did a species that once walked across the landscape completely uncovered decide that covering its body was suddenly essential? And perhaps the stranger question is why it happened only to us. Wolves never sew coats for winter. Horses never wake up wishing for another layer. Even ravens, birds intelligent enough to solve puzzles that challenge many adults, have never looked at a chilly morning and thought, maybe I should put something on. The exact moment this change began has disappeared forever. The first pieces of clothing rotted away tens of thousands of years ago, leaving almost nothing behind for archaeologists to uncover. Yet surprisingly, the trail that leads us back toward that forgotten moment wasn't preserved in animal hides, woven fibers, or ancient tools. It was preserved by parasites. Yes, lice. The longer you think about that sentence, the more you hope there's another explanation. Unfortunately, there isn't. As unpleasant as they are, these tiny hitchhikers ended up recording one of the oldest chapters of human history far better than clothing itself ever could. And their story takes us much closer to the answer than you might imagine. But before we can understand why our ancestors started wearing clothes, we have to answer an even older mystery. Why did humans lose their fur in the first place? One detail about the human body often slips past us because we've lived with it our entire lives. Compared with almost every other large mammal on Earth, we're remarkably bare. Gorillas are wrapped in thick fur. Chimpanzees are covered from head to toe. Wolves, bears, horses, even elephants all carry a natural layer of protection wherever they go, whether they're crossing forests, mountains, or open plains. Then there are humans. Our skin is exposed across most of the body, interrupted only by patches of hair that seem almost random by comparison. Standing beside our closest relatives, we look less like a creature that evolved without fur and more like one that somehow gave it up. That wasn't an accident. Our shared ancestor with chimpanzees almost certainly had a full coat of hair. Yet somewhere along our own evolutionary path, that coat gradually disappeared. The question is why any species would abandon something so useful in the first place. The answer most researchers support has very little to do with fashion, and almost everything to do with endurance. As early humans moved away from dense forests and spent more time crossing open grasslands, survival began to depend on covering long distances under an unforgiving sun. Hunting wasn't always about speed. Often, it was about persistence. If your body overheated halfway through the chase, the hunt was already over. And an unsuccessful hunt didn't just mean going home hungry, it could mean your family did too. Over hundreds of thousands of years, evolution made an extraordinary trade. Instead of relying on fur to regulate body temperature, our ancestors developed one of the most efficient cooling systems in the animal kingdom. Today, the human body carries roughly 2 to 4 million sweat glands, allowing us to release heat with remarkable efficiency during prolonged activity. In a strange way, humans became endurance specialists rather than sprinting specialists, capable of staying active long after many other animals needed to stop and recover. Personally, I think this is one of evolution's most fascinating patterns. It rarely gives a species a perfect solution. More often, it solves one problem by creating another. Losing fur helped our ancestors survive exhausting hunts, but at the same time, it exposed them to an entirely new set of dangers. Without that protective coat, bare skin suddenly faced direct sunlight every single day. This is where the work of evolutionary biologist Nina Jablonski becomes especially important. Her research suggests that as human skin became permanently exposed, natural selection gradually shaped different levels of pigmentation, balancing protection against harmful ultraviolet radiation while still allowing enough sunlight to produce essential vitamins. In other words, losing our fur didn't simply change our appearance, it forced the human body to redesign an entire biological system around living without its original protection. That adaptation worked beautifully beneath the African sun. It worked far less beautifully when temperatures began to fall. Imagine standing in freezing air armed with nothing more than stone tools, simple weapons, and determination. A body built to release heat suddenly becomes a body that loses heat far too quickly. This is why the traditional explanation sounds so convincing at first. Humans entered colder regions, felt the cold, and started wearing animal hides. Simple, logical, easy to understand. But once you compare that story with the actual timeline, cracks begin to appear. Genetic evidence suggests that humans were already wearing clothing sometime between roughly 80,000 and 170,000 years ago. Yet the major wave of migration out of Africa didn't begin until around 70,000 years ago. That creates an uncomfortable gap. If clothing existed long before people reached truly cold environments, then freezing temperatures alone cannot explain why the habit began. Cold eventually made clothing essential, but it probably wasn't the reason clothing was invented in the first place. Something much deeper was already shaping this behavior long before our ancestors stepped into the cold. And that next piece of the story has less to do with climate than with the way humans learned to live together. Under normal circumstances, a mystery like this would probably stay unsolved forever. The first garments humans ever wore were almost certainly made from materials that simply don't survive the passage of time. Animal hides decay. Plant fibers break apart. Leather disappears. Whatever our ancestors wrapped around themselves tens of thousands of years ago vanished long before archaeologists ever had a chance to find it. That left scientists with an unusual problem. If clothing itself was gone, where could its history possibly be hiding? The answer turned out to be somewhere almost nobody expected: inside a parasite. In one of the strangest twists in evolutionary research, a tiny insect ended up preserving evidence that clothing never could. In 2003, geneticist Mark Stoneking and his colleagues in Germany began investigating the evolutionary history of human lice. Later studies, including research from the University of Florida, expanded on that work and revealed a timeline that completely changed how scientists think about the origin of clothing. Fortunately, the biology behind it is surprisingly simple. Humans host two separate kinds of lice. Head lice spend their entire lives in human hair. Body lice, however, live somewhere very different. They survive almost exclusively inside clothing, hiding in seams and folds before crawling onto the skin to feed. Although they look similar, these are two genetically distinct populations that separated from a common ancestor at a specific point in human history. That split is the crucial clue. Unlike head lice, body lice cannot establish long-term populations on bare skin alone. They depend on clothing to survive and reproduce. In other words, body lice could only evolve after humans began wearing garments regularly enough to create an entirely new habitat for them. When researchers calculated when that genetic split occurred, the results consistently pointed to a window between roughly 83,000 and 170,000 years ago. Think about how extraordinary that is for a moment. One of the oldest pieces of evidence for human clothing wasn't preserved in a cave, buried beneath layers of soil, or carved into stone. It was accidentally recorded inside one of humanity's least welcome companions. In a strange sense, lice noticed we had started getting dressed long before history ever did. I have to admit, there's something oddly fascinating about that. We often imagine history being preserved by magnificent monuments or spectacular discoveries. Yet sometimes the smallest and most unpleasant creatures end up becoming the most reliable witnesses. That discovery also raises a much bigger question. If humans were already wearing clothing long before large populations expanded into truly freezing environments, then staying warm probably wasn't the original reason. Cold eventually made clothing indispensable, but it doesn't seem to explain why clothing appeared in the first place. So what did those earliest garments actually do? Researchers generally focus on two leading possibilities. The first is surprisingly practical. Not protection from freezing temperatures, but protection from the everyday hazards of living with exposed skin. Imagine spending every day walking upright through dry grass, thorny shrubs, rocky ground, and swarms of biting insects while tracking animals across long distances. Even a simple animal hide draped across the body would shield the skin from cuts, stings, intense sunlight, and constant abrasion. It wasn't elegant. It didn't need to be. Sometimes the most ordinary explanation turns out to be the strongest one. Comparisons with our closest relatives support that idea as well. Chimpanzees living near open woodland habitats never cover themselves. But they also don't spend hours crossing waist-high vegetation on two legs, while pursuing prey over vast distances. Our combination of hairless skin, upright posture, and endurance hunting created a challenge unlike anything our closest relatives experienced. The second possibility takes the story in a completely different direction. It suggests clothing wasn't only about surviving the environment, it was about surviving society. Humans have always been extraordinarily social creatures. Long before cities, kingdoms, or written language existed, our ancestors were constantly reading one another. Status, trust, maturity, identity, and belonging were all communicated through visible signals. Today, we do it through hairstyles, uniforms, jewelry, and fashion. Tens of thousands of years ago, the signals were probably much simpler, but the instinct behind them may have been exactly the same. Archaeological evidence shows that humans were already decorating their bodies with red ochre pigments around 200,000 years ago, well before the earliest estimates for regular clothing. That timeline is remarkably important because it suggests the desire to communicate visually may have appeared before garments themselves. Our ancestors were using their own skin as a canvas long before they consistently covered it. No one can reconstruct the exact meaning of those painted patterns. A particular color may have marked adulthood. Another might have identified a successful hunter, a grieving family member, or someone preparing for a ceremony. The details have disappeared with time, but the underlying behavior remains unmistakable. Humans wanted to be recognized. They wanted others to understand something about them before a single word was spoken. From that perspective, the leap from painted skin to carefully selected animal hides wasn't a giant revolution. It was simply the next logical step in expressing identity. You could almost call it humanity's first fashion competition. Only instead of luxury brands or designer labels, a small community of prehistoric hunters may have been quietly wondering whose animal hide told the better story. For much of human prehistory, clothing was probably about as simple as it could be. Imagine an animal hide draped over your shoulders, secured with strips of sinew, and roughly shaped using nothing more than a sharpened stone. It wasn't tailored, it wasn't comfortable, it certainly wasn't fashionable. Its only purpose was to solve an immediate problem. If it kept you alive for another day, it had done its job. Then, around 50,000 years ago, something remarkable appeared in the archaeological record. Not another spear, not a better hand axe, a sewing needle, and not just a sharpened piece of bone used to punch holes through leather. Researchers began discovering genuine-eyed needles, complete with tiny drilled openings designed to pull sinew through animal hides with surprising precision. That single innovation changed clothing from something simply thrown over the body into something deliberately shaped around it. One of the oldest confirmed examples comes from Denisova Cave in Siberia, where archaeologists uncovered an eyed needle carved from the hollow bone of a bird and dated to roughly 50,000 years ago. Think about what that object represents. Someone first had to imagine a tool that didn't yet exist. Then they had to choose the right material, carve it carefully enough that it wouldn't snap, drill an opening small enough to hold thread, and finally use it to produce neat, repeatable stitches. That isn't just craftsmanship. It's planning, experimentation, and patience, working together toward a completely new solution. Personally, I find that far more impressive than the needle itself. The real invention wasn't the piece of bone. It was the ability to picture an idea before it existed and then patiently turn that idea into reality. That kind of thinking would eventually give us far more than better clothing. It would become one of the defining characteristics of our species. Today, we even have experimental evidence showing why this seemingly small invention mattered so much. Archaeologist Ian Gilligan and his team conducted controlled experiments using heated, instrumented mannequins dressed in different types of prehistoric clothing. Some mannequins wore loose animal hide coverings similar to the earliest garments. Others wore carefully fitted clothing reconstructed from designs that could only have been produced with bone needles. The difference wasn't minor. Under cold, windy conditions, the tailored garments consistently retained far more heat than simple draped hides. Layered clothing trapped pockets of warm air close to the skin, while reducing heat loss around areas like the wrists and neck, two places where the human body loses warmth especially quickly. In many ways, those carefully sewn garments behaved less like blankets and more like an extension of the body itself. That changes the way we should think about the invention of the needle. It wasn't merely another craft tool. It effectively allowed humans to build a second skin. And the timing could hardly have been better. As colder climate spread across much of the world, that extra layer may have arrived just before some of the harshest environmental challenges our species would ever face. What's equally fascinating is that our ancestors weren't alone in discovering this solution. Long before modern humans encountered Neanderthals, they were already preparing animal hides and making practical use of them. Archaeologists have uncovered stone tools specifically shaped for scraping and processing leather, along with animal bones bearing marks left behind during hide preparation. Their own bodies tell a similar story. Stockier builds, broader chests, and shorter limbs all point toward populations that had adapted to surviving severe cold over many generations. Some researchers believe producing and maintaining clothing at that level required much more than individual skill. Hides had to be collected, cleaned, scraped, softened, repaired, and replaced. Those tasks demanded planning, shared knowledge, and cooperation inside the group. That's a level of social organization we often overlook, because for far too long, Neanderthals were unfairly dismissed as little more than primitive cave dwellers. The more evidence we uncover, the harder that stereotype becomes to defend. In fact, nearly everyone with ancestry outside Africa still carries a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA today. That means their story didn't simply disappear. Part of it survives inside millions of people walking the earth right now. Whatever knowledge they developed about surviving freezing landscapes, working hides, and protecting the human body wasn't completely lost. In one way or another, pieces of that legacy became part of our own. There was another branch of the human family discovering many of these ideas at roughly the same time. The Denisovans. Identified only within the last few decades from a single finger bone recovered in Denisova Cave, remain one of the most mysterious human groups we know. Yet the cave yielded more than bones. In layers dating to roughly the same period as the famous bone needle, archaeologists also uncovered carefully pierced ornaments. Objects that hint at symbolic thinking and perhaps even the decoration of clothing itself. Whatever exactly those ornaments were used for, they suggest that the desire to dress the body was not unique to Homo sapiens. Different human lineages, living in different places, appear to have reached surprisingly similar solutions on their own. That makes the next chapter of the story even more interesting. If clothing existed only to keep people comfortable, human societies would probably have settled on whatever design worked best for the local climate and never looked back. But archaeology tells a very different story. Almost as soon as clothing became common, it also became meaningful. Certain garments identified leaders. Others distinguished warriors, religious figures, or members of particular communities. Even the dead were often buried wearing clothing that reflected who they had been during life. Some of the oldest surviving textile fragments were intentionally dyed in different colors, showing that thousands of years ago, people were already making choices that went beyond simple survival. In my view, this is the moment clothing stopped being just a tool and became a form of communication. Long before written language connected distant civilizations, what people wore may already have been telling others something about identity, status, or belonging. In many ways, humans didn't simply invent clothing, we invented another language, and that language never disappeared. Look around today and the pattern is still everywhere. Weddings, funerals, military uniforms, courtroom robes, graduation gowns, each one tells a story before anyone speaks. We continue to assign meaning to fabric in ways no other known species does. Temperature alone has never explained why a judge wears robes or why a soldier wears a uniform. Clothing became part of how humans understand one another. Even so, warmth would soon become impossible to ignore. Between roughly 120,000 and 70,000 years ago, repeated glacial cycles transformed large parts of the planet. Temperatures dropped dramatically, while vast regions of Africa became increasingly dry and difficult to survive in. Some estimates suggest the total human population may have fallen to only 10 to 30,000 individuals. Our species came remarkably close to disappearing altogether. Those harsh conditions also shaped who would eventually spread across the world. The populations that successfully expanded into Europe and Northern Asia were almost always the ones that had already mastered fitted, layered clothing. Others simply failed to survive those journeys. In freezing landscapes, properly sewn garments were no longer symbols of identity. They became life-saving technology. Trapping warm air close to the body and protecting the areas where heat escaped most rapidly. More importantly, that knowledge could not remain with one individual. It had to be taught. Every generation inherited techniques for preparing hides, sewing layers together, and surviving climates their bodies alone were never designed to endure. Personally, I think this is one of the clearest reminders that humanity's greatest adaptation was never just biology. It was our ability to preserve knowledge and pass it forward. Over time, animal hides were joined by something even more versatile. People learned to spin plant fibers into thread and weave them into cloth. Evidence from Juzuana Cave in present-day Georgia includes microscopic flax fibers dating back roughly 30,000 years, some already colored with natural dyes. That innovation would eventually grow into one of the foundations of civilization itself, supporting trade, craftsmanship, and entire economies. But that belongs to a later chapter. The important point is that none of those achievements would have happened without the first decision to cover the human body. Clothing didn't emerge because people wanted fashion or commerce. Those came much later. The first garment solved a problem. And from that single solution, countless other human innovations quietly followed. So, why did ancient humans really begin wearing clothes? The most honest answer is that there was never a single reason. Instead, clothing emerged as several needs gradually converged. At first, it was probably nothing more than a practical barrier, protecting exposed skin from relentless sunlight, biting insects, sharp vegetation, and the countless small hazards of everyday survival. Before long, it became something more. It evolved into a way of communicating, allowing people to express identity, status, and belonging without saying a single word. Then, as climates grew colder and environments became increasingly unforgiving, clothing transformed into one of humanity's most important survival technologies. And as cultures continued to grow more complex, garments eventually became part of how entire civilizations expressed tradition, belief, and social order. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this story isn't that humans invented clothing, it's that, looking back, it almost feels inevitable. A species as cooperative as ours, as symbolic as ours, and as dependent on adapting to new environments as ours, was always going to create something that served all of those purposes at once. Clothing didn't simply cover the human body. It became another tool our ancestors used to solve problems that biology alone could not. Personally, I think that's one of the quiet lessons hidden inside this story. Human evolution has never been driven only by stronger muscles or larger brains. Time and again, our greatest advantage has come from combining simple ideas into solutions that could be shared, improved, and passed from one generation to the next. Clothing is one of those ideas. It began as a small innovation, yet it quietly changed where humans could live, how they cooperated, and eventually how they understood themselves. That same instinct is still with you today. Whatever you're wearing at this very moment wasn't chosen completely at random. Whether you realized it or not, you made a series of decisions this morning about how you wanted to present yourself. The outfit you wear to an important interview is different from what you wear while relaxing at home. The clothes you choose for a celebration are different from the ones you wear to a funeral. Those choices aren't only about comfort, they're also about the message you want other people to receive before you've spoken your first sentence. In a surprising way, you're following the same ancient instinct that guided someone standing beside a fire nearly 90,000 years ago, perhaps brushing ochre across their skin or wrapping themselves in a carefully prepared hide before joining the rest of their group. The materials have changed, the world has changed, but the desire to communicate something about ourselves through what we wear has remained astonishingly consistent across thousands of generations. 90,000 years of human history are quietly connected to the simple act of getting dressed this morning. When you think about it that way, clothing stops feeling ordinary. It becomes one more reminder that modern life is filled with behaviors whose roots stretch back to the earliest chapters of our species. And maybe that's the funniest part of all. First, we got cold, then we got creative, then we invented clothing. And after all those thousands of years of innovation, fashion, and technology, many of us still open the closet and insist we have absolutely nothing to wear. Some parts of being human never seem to change. Now I'm curious to hear your thoughts. If you had the chance to live exactly as our distant ancestors once did, without clothing of any kind, would you actually choose to do it? Let me know down in the comments. Thanks for watching, take care, and I'll see you in the next video.